At 68, my children saw me as an antique, ready for the scrap heap. They presented their golden years transition plan, a polite term for selling my home and discarding me. But they underestimated the silent strength forged over decades, and the explosive power of a woman who finally decides to reclaim her own narrative. At 68, sitting in my late husband Richard's favorite leather armchair, I felt less like a person and more like a piece of antique furniture being appraised. The air in my own living room, usually smelling of lemon polish and old books, was thick with the cloying scent of my daughter's perfume and my son's ambition. They stood before me, a united front of feigned solicitude. Mark, a real estate agent whose smile never quite reached his eyes, and Susan, her face a carefully constructed mask of performative concern. "It's just too much for you, Mom," Susan began, her voice dripping with a sympathy I knew was counterfeit. "All these stairs, the garden, we worry ourselves sick." Mark took his cue, stepping forward as if addressing a potential client. "And the market is peaking. We're talking about unlocking a significant amount of equity here. It's a financial burden you shouldn't have to carry." He used words like right-sizing and asset management, terms that turned the home Richard and I had filled with 45 years of life into a line item on a spreadsheet. He placed a crisp, white binder on the polished mahogany coffee table. The sound it made was a definitive, sterile thud that seemed to echo in the cavernous silence of the room. The label, printed in a bold, offensively cheerful font, read, "Carolyn's Golden Years Transition Plan," a plan they had created without a single word of input from the person whose life it was meant to dictate. My fingers traced the familiar, worn cracks in the armchair's leather, a map of the thousands of evenings Richard and I had sat here. I could still see him, laughing at some silly television show, his glasses perched on his nose. This was the room where we'd brought both Mark and Susan home from the hospital, the spot on the Persian rug where Susan took her first wobbly steps. It wasn't an asset. It was a living, breathing archive of our love. I looked from my son's predatory gleam to my daughter's impatient fidgeting. I saw the future they envisioned for me, a quiet, manageable burden in a small, dark room, my only purpose to have freed up the capital tied up in these walls. Through their entire, detailed presentation, a single, deafening silence screamed louder than any of their words. Not once did either of them look me in the eye and ask what I wanted. This carefully orchestrated ambush hadn't materialized overnight. It was the culmination of a year-long campaign of psychological warfare, waged with gentle smiles and loving words. It began almost the day after Richard's funeral, when the house was still filled with the scent of sympathy lilies. Their initial calls felt like a comfort in the crushing silence. "Mom, are you eating properly? The house must feel so empty," Susan would coo through the phone. Mark would add, "You know, if anything ever breaks, just call me. A big place like that can be a handful." I clung to these gestures, mistaking their hovering for love, their concern for genuine care. I was adrift in a sea of grief, and their voices were a lifeline, or so I chose to believe. The tone began to shift so subtly I almost didn't notice. The lifeline started to feel more like a net, tightening around me. Mark's calls, once about his kids or his work, began to include unsolicited market analyses. "A house on Elm Street, just 2 blocks over, sold for an absolute fortune, Mom. Can you believe it?" he'd say with feigned astonishment. "The market is on fire." One Sunday, he dropped by with a glossy brochure from his agency featuring a newly listed modern condo. "Just thought you'd be interested in what's out there, Mom. So sleek, so manageable." He left it on the kitchen counter, a silent testament to the future he was designing for me. Susan's tactics were more direct, a form of emotional plundering. During her weekly visits, she'd wander through the rooms, her eyes not seeing a home, but a showroom. She'd run a proprietary hand over my mother's porcelain music box. "You know, Mom," she'd sigh, "when you eventually decide to downsize, I should really take this. My Lisa would adore it." It wasn't a request, it was a claim. She had already mentally tagged every valuable item, from the sterling silver tea set she planned to use for her garden parties to the antique writing desk in Richard's study, which she insisted would be perfect for my husband's home office. They began to subtly undermine my confidence. making me feel incompetent in the very home I had managed for nearly half a century. A burnt-out light bulb in the hallway became a major electrical hazard. A leaky faucet was a sign of impending plumbing collapse. They spoke of me as if I were a fragile child, incapable and forgetful. I started to second-guess myself, the constant drip of their concern eroding my own sense of capability. Was the house too big? Was I being a stubborn old woman, clinging to the past? I tried to rationalize their behavior, to find the love buried beneath the greed. But a persistent, chilling feeling began to creep in. It was the feeling of being objectified, of my identity slowly being erased and replaced by the value of my property. I wasn't Carolyn, their mother, anymore. I was the keeper of their inheritance, an obstacle to be managed. Which brings me back to the living room, to the white binder sitting on the table like a tombstone for the life I knew. Mark, beaming with self-satisfaction, flipped it open. "So, I've taken the liberty of drawing up some paperwork to get the ball rolling," he announced, his voice booming with false magnanimity. He turned the binder around for me to see. There it was, a real estate listing agreement, the exclusive rights to sell my home, handed over to my son's agency. Most of the fields were already filled in with my name, the property address, and a suggested listing price that made my breath catch. All that was missing was my signature on the dotted line at the bottom. It was an act of supreme arrogance, a presumption so profound it felt like a physical blow. Before I could even process the document, Susan chimed in, her voice bright and giddy, the thin veneer of concern completely gone. "And Mom, once we get you moved in, that silver cutlery set of yours would be perfect for the dinner party I'm hosting next month. You know, the big one for my husband's promotion. It would be so much more impressive than my stainless steel." That was it, the final, brutal snap. The silver cutlery. A wedding gift from my own parents, used for every Christmas, every Thanksgiving, every significant family milestone since I was 22. To her, it wasn't a vessel of memories. It was a prop to impress her friends. In that single, breathtakingly selfish moment, all the pretenses shattered. I saw them with a terrifying clarity. They weren't my loving children concerned for my welfare. They were vultures, circling, patiently waiting for me to pick the carcass of my life clean. A vision of Richard flashed in my mind, his warm smile, the way he'd always called this house our fortress of peace. A wave of shame and betrayal washed over me, so potent it was nauseating. I had allowed his memory, our memory, to be tarnished by their greed. This wasn't care. This wasn't family. This was a hostile takeover. After they left, buzzing with the certainty of their victory, a profound silence descended upon the house. I didn't cry. The shock was too deep, the betrayal too cold for tears. I remained in Richard's armchair long after the sun had set, the shadows stretching and enveloping the room like a shroud. But as the moon cast its pale light through the bay windows, something inside me shifted. The grief that had clouded my judgment for a year began to recede, replaced by a crystalline, righteous anger. This house wasn't a burden, and I was not a problem to be solved. The next morning, I didn't call a grief counselor. I called David Chen, Richard's longtime estate lawyer and friend. David was a sharp, compassionate man who had helped us draft our wills years ago. I sat in his calm, book-lined office and for the first time laid out the entire story, the subtle manipulations, the emotional blackmail, the final, insulting transition plan. He listened patiently, his expression hardening with each detail. When I finished, he didn't offer platitudes. He offered power. "Carolyn," he said, his voice firm, "let's be perfectly clear. This house and every single thing in it is yours. 100%. Richard made sure of that. Your children have no legal claim to any of it until you decide to give it to them." Then he slid a document across his desk. It wasn't our will, but an addendum to Richard's life insurance policy. I'd known the policy existed, a substantial sum, but I had been too numb to deal with it. David pointed to a handwritten note from Richard at the bottom, a note I'd never seen. His familiar, strong script seemed to leap off the page. It read, "For my brilliant Carolyn, may this give you the means to pursue any dream that brings you joy and purpose in your later years. Live freely, my love." Those words were not a key. They were a stick of dynamite. They blew open a door in my heart I thought had been sealed forever. A dream, a purpose. The idea, dormant for so long, began to spark. This house wasn't just a collection of memories. It was a resource. It had space, it had light, it had a soul. And I had the means. Over the next 6 weeks, David and I became a clandestine 2-person task force. We legally established a nonprofit foundation, the Richard and Carolyn Lightward Foundation. I met with a young, visionary architect who saw not an old house to be gutted, but a sanctuary to be enhanced. We drew up plans not for demolition, but for restoration, converting the large downstairs rooms into shared studios and workspaces, and the upper bedrooms into simple, peaceful living quarters. And the crowning jewel, the entire third-floor attic with its stunning arched windows, would be transformed into my own private apartment. While my children were likely picking out paint swatches for my guest room, I was secretly interviewing the first candidates for my new home. A young poet fleeing a toxic family, a painter whose scholarship had just run out, a musician composing her first symphony. I was no longer just protecting my home. I was giving it a new, vibrant life. I let them marinate in their perceived victory for another 2 weeks. Then I called them. "Mark, Susan," I said, my voice even and calm, a stark contrast to the trembling woman they'd last seen. "I've made my decision about the house. I'd like you both to come over Sunday afternoon so we can go over the details." I could almost hear the triumphant clinking of champagne glasses through the phone. They arrived precisely on time, their spouses in tow, all 4 of them radiating an aura of smug finality. They found me not in Richard's armchair, but seated at the head of the long mahogany dining table, a place Richard had always insisted was mine. In front of me was not Mark's white binder, but a sleek, dark blue folder. I let them settle, their eager, hungry eyes fixed on me. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my voice resonating with a newfound authority. "I've given your proposal a great deal of thought, and as a result, I have made a final decision regarding this house and my future." Mark leaned forward, a pen already poised over a notepad he'd brought. "Great, Mom. So did you sign the listing agreement? We can have photos done by Wednesday." I offered a small, cool smile. "No, I won't be signing that." I paused, letting the silence hang in the air before delivering the first blow. "This house will not be sold." The shift in the room was instantaneous. 4 smiles faltered. "What?" Susan asked, her voice sharp. I ignored her, reaching for the blue folder. I slid 4 professionally bound documents across the polished wood, 1 for each of them. "Instead," I continued, my voice clear and steady, "I have taken steps to ensure this house continues to serve a purpose. It is being converted into a sanctuary for artists. A residence for young women with creative talent who need a safe and inspiring place to live and work. It will be called the Dawnlight House." I watched their faces morph from confusion to disbelief. Mark fumbled with the document, his eyes scanning the legal jargon. "What is this?" "A nonprofit. The Richard and Carolyn Lightward Foundation," he sputtered, the name of his father on the page seeming to physically repel him. "That's correct," I said. "I've used the entirety of your father's life insurance to establish and endow a foundation that will operate the Dawnlight House in perpetuity. I will be serving as its lifetime chairwoman." I leaned back in my chair, savoring the moment. "As for my own living arrangements, you needn't worry. I won't be needing your guest room, Mark. The architects are already finalizing the plans for my new residence." I let my gaze sweep over their stunned, slack-jawed faces before delivering the final, devastating piece of information. "I'll be living in the penthouse suite we're building on the 3rd floor." For a full 10 seconds, the only sound was the frantic rustling of paper as they stared at the legal proof of their overturned expectations. Then the dam of their composure broke. Mark was the first to explode. He shot to his feet, slamming his hand on the dining table with a force that made the silver salt shaker jump. "Are you insane?" he roared, his face turning a blotchy red. "This is a multi-million-dollar asset. You can't just turn it into a hippie commune for freeloaders. This is our inheritance. Our money. It was never your money, Mark," I stated, my voice cutting through his rage like ice. "It was your father's and now it is mine. And this is what I've chosen to do with it. Susan, seeing that anger wasn't working, switched tactics to her specialty: emotional blackmail. Tears, large and theatrical, welled up in her eyes. "Mom, how could you be so selfish?" she wailed, her voice cracking with manufactured heartbreak. "After all we've done, all our worrying, you'd rather give your home, our family home, to a bunch of strangers than live with your own children. Your own grandchildren." That was the line, the one I had been waiting for. I stood up, slowly, feeling a strength in my spine that had been absent for years. I looked directly at Susan, then at Mark. "This family home?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "Let's talk about this family. A family is supposed to be a circle of love and support, not a line of people waiting for a handout. My home stopped being a family home in your eyes the moment you started seeing it as a real estate listing. My silver wasn't for family memories, Susan. It was for impressing your husband's boss. My future wasn't about my happiness, Mark. It was about your commission." I let the truth of my words sink in, watching the color drain from their faces. "You speak of inheritance. Your father and I gave you the greatest inheritance of all. A stable upbringing, a good education, and a foundation of love from which to build your own lives. The rest is not a right you are owed. It is a gift. And when I looked at you both, I realized you were not worthy of that gift, so I decided to give it to people who are." I walked to the grand entryway and opened the front door, letting the cool afternoon air sweep in. "Now I believe this meeting is over. Please leave my house. And in the future, please remember that this is the home of the Dawnlight Foundation. Visits will be by appointment only." That was 3 months ago. The transformation of the house has been as profound as the transformation within myself. The oppressive silence of my grief has been replaced by a symphony of creation. On any given day, the house hums with life. There's the rhythmic scratching of charcoal on canvas from the downstairs drawing studio, the soaring notes of a violin drifting from the music room in the West Wing, and the constant, comforting aroma of coffee and freshly baked bread wafting from the communal kitchen. My penthouse suite on the 3rd floor is my sanctuary. The arched windows, once dusty and forgotten, now frame a perfect view of the changing seasons in the garden below. The space is filled with light, my own furniture, and a profound sense of peace. This morning, I was having tea on my small terrace with Emily, a brilliant young sculptor who fled a controlling family with nothing but a backpack and a portfolio of her work. We were excitedly discussing the plans for her first solo exhibition, which the foundation is fully funding. The texts from my children still come, of course. They have cycled through all the stages of entitled rage. First came the furious, all-caps accusations and threats of legal action, which David Chen quickly and decisively shut down. Then came the wheedling, manipulative apologies, filled with hollow promises to do better and desperate pleas to reconsider what you're doing to this family. I read them, not with anger or pain anymore, but with a distant, clinical pity. Then I delete them without a reply. They made their choices. I have made mine. Sometimes I stand at my window and watch the young women in the garden below, reading, talking, laughing. They are a vibrant, thriving ecosystem of support and creativity. They see me not as a burden or a bank account, but as Carolyn, the woman who gave them a chance, a safe harbor. They bring me their triumphs and their troubles, sharing their art and their lives with a respect and gratitude my own children could never muster. I lost a family that saw me as an obstacle, and in its place, I have gained a world. A world filled with art, with purpose, and with hope. I am no longer just a widow in a big, empty house. I am the architect of my own beautiful, bustling, and gloriously free new life.